You know, this is working out real well. Isn't it?
All right, so let's talk about carbohydrates.
Are we having any lecture on Wednesday?
No, Wednesday will just be review, questions, going through problems, whatever you want to do, and check out from lab. All right, what are carbohydrates? You know? Yes, sir. What? No.
No.
Well, as you might guess, it has something to do with sugar. They're big sugars, small sugars. It's actually the entire category of all sugar type stuff. That's starches, sugars and starches. Why are they called carbohydrates? You know? They do have carbons and hydrogens, but there's a lot of stuff that has carbons and hydrogens that's not carbohydrates. It actually has to do with the proportion of elements. So carbohydrates tend to have a formula of carbon, some number of carbons, and then some number of H2Os together. So for instance, glucose, which is a simple sugar, and we'll talk about what glucose looks, the structure of glucose in a minute, but the formula of glucose is C6H12O6, which another way to write that would be C6H2O6. So it's like 6 carbons and 6 waters together. So it's hydrated carbon. And these were originally discovered in this way by basically cooking them off and measuring what was coming off at high temperatures, which was predominantly water, so they could tell that there was this kind of balance, and that's where this name comes from, carbohydrates. So they're molecules made from carbon and water. Now we know them as just organic molecules that have some specific functional groups. So we'll start there. The simplest sugar is actually not glucose. It is this molecule. Let me redraw that. Doing the same problem again. Okay. Make sure I have the stereochemistry right. I always mess this one up. Sorry. This is in the book, by the way. This is chapter 17. This molecule is called D-glyceraldehyde. Simplest sugar. Do you know the structure of glycerol or glycerin? It's just like this, but with an OH at the top instead of this thing. And this aldehyde at the top makes it a sugar. So a sugar in general, or a carbohydrate in general, is going to have an aldehyde or ketone functional group, so a carbon double bond oxygen, and then OHs on all the rest of the carbons. And all sugars will have that. So because this was called because this is an aldehyde functional group here, right, that's called an aldehyde. This falls into the category of aldoses. So this is called an aldose. You'll notice in general that sugars always have this suffix ose, O-S-E. If you hear that suffix, we're probably talking about a sugar. So you hear things like glucose or sucrose or fructose. All those things have to do with sugars. That's a sugar suffix. That's what tells you you're dealing with a carbohydrate. Another category that this falls in is that this molecule is called a triose. Why do you think it's called a triose? What do you think that refers to? Yeah, there's 3 carbons. So they're also split up into a number of carbons. So you have trioses, tetrose, pentose, and hexoses, and then you have the aldoses and the ketoses, depending on if it's an aldehyde or a ketone. Now there are a whole bunch of sugars and a whole bunch of structures, and we're not going to get into like memorizing the different names of different types of sugars or whatnot. I'm just going to show you some of the different ones. One thing we do have to remember, since we talked about it a long time ago and we didn't really get too into it, was Fisher projections. Do we remember that? What that means?
Yeah.
Kind of? Yeah. Yeah. So the way that I've written this here, this is actually in a Fisher projection. And a lot of times we won't even write that central carbon. We'll just write it like this. So this would be how this thing is abbreviated. Same molecule. CHO is an abbreviation for an aldehyde functional group. And this projection tells us about the stereochemistry. So stereochemistry in sugars is very important. In fact, the only thing that separates many sugars from each other is the different stereochemistries of the different carbons. So in this case, recall from before that a Fisher projection and you can go back to the stereochemistry chapter to review this, but a Fisher projection means that the ones on the sides are coming out at you and the ones at the top and the bottom are going back. So it means this. Right. To convert that to our standard dash wedge notation, we have to kind of twist it around a little bit. So anyway, we can do that if we need to. The point is that sugars are one of the only areas where we still use these Fisher projections regularly, and you'll see how it becomes actually really helpful to have that, to have this type of thing, even though this is really cumbersome when it comes to other stereochemistry things or assigning R and S. When we talk about sugars, this will become a little bit more convenient. So I'm going to actually just show you the table from the book rather than try to write all this stuff, and talk a little bit about the structures in general and how and I'll ask you about how they're the same and how they're different. So this is table 17.1 on page 589 if you're following along. And here we have, so I'll put the structure, I'll zoom in eventually, but here we have kind of a family tree of sugars. And what this is showing is the different sugars or the different monosaccharides, single molecule sugars, that you get from adding carbons. So we're going to start right up at the top here with the glyceraldehyde that we just looked at. Okay. Now when glyceraldehyde, if you add one carbon to glyceraldehyde, you can do it in two ways. About just enough to get these guys so that they get completely hard to see. Okay. So you can do it one of two ways. You leave that bottom carbon with the OH on the right as it is, and then the next one up, you can either put the OH on the right or on the left. Now that's a stereochemical change. That's like an R and an S. I don't know which one it is right here. Well, we could go through it, but anyway, you can see how with these Fisher projections, it's very clear that there's a difference there. That you've got the one staying on the right on the bottom, and then the next one could go right or left. And depending on which way that goes, those are totally different sugars. Erythrose versus threose. They're going to have different behaviors in your body. They're going to have different, they're going to be used for different things in the physiology of it. I don't know the details of that stuff, so you have to go to a different class for all of that. But totally different just by changing that stereochemistry because of the way the enzymes will react with them. So then you add one more. You now have the pentoses, sugars with 5 carbons, ribose, arabinose, xylose, and lysose, which again only differ by the position of that OH. So all of those will have the same formula, the same connectivity, but the different stereochemistry leads to different products completely. And then finally the hexoses, which are 6 carbon sugars at the bottom. And the most common sugar, perhaps the most important sugar right down here, is glucose, D-glucose. But you see there's this whole library of other sugars just like glucose with slight stereochemical differences. And because of those slight stereochemical differences, they're used in different ways and produced in different ways throughout biological processes. So these are the straight chain monosaccharides. You don't have to memorize the names. What do you notice is, what do you think is the significance of that OH that's in brown or orange that's highlighted here? Yeah, it's staying on the same side throughout all of these. And that is actually the part of the molecule that leads to this letter D, this classification of D. See that on all of these? There's a little D before it. D is a stereochemical designation that is kind of like RNS. Oops. So if we look back at that simple sugar again, glyceraldehyde right here, there's D-glyceraldehyde and L-glyceraldehyde. And we didn't really talk about what this thing means, this alpha D25 business. But chiral molecules can affect light in a particular way. You take something called plain polarized light, which is light that's been polarized, like polarized sunglasses, and then you pass it through a chiral substance, and the chiral substance rotates that light. And so an enantiomer would rotate it one way, and the other enantiomer would rotate it the other way. And D stands for dextrorotatory, which is to the right, and L stands for levorotatory, which is to the left. So enantiomers will do this in these different ways. Now, in our bodies and in nature, almost all sugars are D sugars. So we almost never encounter the L sugars, and they're not as important biologically, so we don't talk about them as much. So mostly we'll be dealing with the D sugars, and the way, just from convention, any sugar that has that bottom OH on the right is called a D whatever, and if it has it on the left, it's an L whatever. And the rest of the OHs are measured in relation to that. So being on the same side or the opposite side from that particular one. All right. So let's look now at some interesting structural features of the sugars, of the monosaccharides. We're going to look just for now at glucose. Another name for a monosaccharide is a simple sugar, because it's a simple one molecule. We'll see in a little bit how these things can link up to make very, very large molecules that we call polysaccharides or complex carbohydrates or complex sugars. Let's first look at glucose, because we said that was an important one. So we're going to draw that in this Fisher projection. It's got an aldehyde on top and a carbon with an OH on the bottom. And then for the D-glucose, we're going to have the OH on the right, and then the right again, and then the left, and then the right. Okay. And that's D-glucose. Now this is a nice way to think about glucose and all those other sugars. It makes it for a nice table when we put them all together like that. However, sugars don't actually tend to hang around in this form very much. Does anybody know what a sugar looks like usually in a system? I don't know if anybody's ever seen structures of these types of things before. They actually take a ring structure. They cyclize. And the way that they do that is this OH, this oxygen here, actually connects to the carbon up here. And it turns that aldehyde into an alcohol. Now, we didn't really get into that chemistry, chemistry of aldehyde addition. That was a chapter that we skipped. So we won't go into the full mechanism and everything. But when that connects, it leads to two possible structures. And for that, we bring back our good friend, the chair conformation. Right? Everybody missed that? These make cyclohexane type structures, but with an oxygen in them. So I'm going to draw it, and then we'll go through and talk about where that came from and how we got it. I'm also just going to draw the OHs just so it doesn't get too messy, but there's also a hydrogen on each carbon. Okay. This is called beta D glucopyranose. Beta D glucopyranose, that's kind of a fun name. The gluco, of course, is from glucose. Pyranose is that PYR comes from pyran, which is a 6-membered ring with an oxygen in it. So a ring with an oxygen in it is called a pyran. And the beta has to do with how, with the stereochemistry when it's connected. So where did these things come from? We're going to number the carbons here, starting down here. That carbon number 1, that CH2OH, is right here. So then this carbon is right here, number 2. Then we'll number up 3, 4, 5, the ones connected to it. So that's 3, 4, and 5. And then the aldehyde carbon ends up being this carbon over here, known as the anomeric carbon. That has some special properties with the sugar chemistry that we won't really get into. But so there are a couple forms that this can take, but this is the most common, most stable form. One thing you'll notice is that in this beta D glucopyranose, all OHs are equatorial. And that's considered, right, every one of those OHs is on an equatorial bond. And that's considered a main reason that glucose is the most important sugar and the most common sugar, because it can adopt the most stable molecule, where they're all equatorial. Other sugars can't do that because the stereochemistry changes. So if we try to convert some of those other sugars into their pyranose forms, we don't get that nice all the way around equatorial behavior. So let's talk about some other sugars that we might know. Sucrose. What's sucrose? Anybody know that one? Not like structure-wise, but have you heard of it? Where do we encounter it? Yeah, this is table sugar. This is that common white powder that you see. Most of the stuff is made with it. So if we look at some of the ingredients. Okay. If it says sugar, first ingredient, right? Sugar. Awesome. This one got rid. But also sugar. It's actually in 2 places because the chocolate has ingredient of sugar, first ingredient is sugar, and then the candy shell is also sugar. I want to see if anybody says this more specific, but I'm pretty sure they all just say sugar. So sugar is sucrose. If it just says sugar, we're talking about sucrose, which is actually a disaccharide. What do you think that means? If glucose is a monosaccharide, what do you think a disaccharide is? Yeah, 2 of the other ones stuck together. Sugars can react with each other to form what's called a glycoside bond. And one of those is a disaccharide of glucose and fructose. So that looks like this. We're going to draw that glucose structure again. And then right down here at this position, I told you that position was a little bit special. That's where we're going to connect it. So this one actually comes straight down and then connects to fructose, which looks a little bit different because it makes a 5-membered ring. Okay. So we don't need to, you don't need to deal that, know that structure or anything like that. What? Right now? No, I suppose not. Let me save this though, because I don't think this is actually saved. Okay. What? They're always connected through the oxygen. Yeah. Yep. And usually at that position as well. At least on one of the sugars through that position. So this part is glucose. And this part is fructose. So it's like half glucose, half fructose. That's also often how it's broken down. But that linkage will break first, that oxygen. So this is what an interesting thing that comes out of this, kind of an aside, is this idea or this product called high fructose corn syrup. Have you heard of this? What do you know about high fructose corn syrup? Not good for you? How much fructose is in high fructose corn syrup?
Saturated, it's not really fructose.
Well, it is. We'll talk about a little bit what it means, but the most common fructose that we encounter is known as HFCS55, which is about 55% fructose. So it's essentially the same as sugar, as sucrose. If this is 50-50 and this is 55%, that's not really a whole lot. The name high fructose corn syrup comes from higher than corn syrup. So you'll notice in a lot of these things, yeah, anything that has kind of a chewy consistency to it is probably going to have sugar and corn syrup in it. That's the second ingredient on Tootsie Rolls. I'm guessing these have two. These also have invert sugar, which we talked about. And then, yeah, corn syrup and Skittles also. So corn syrup comes from corn. Has anybody ever used it? You use it in baking. It's like Caro syrup. Yeah, right.
It's not a big thing in bakeries.
Right. Yeah.
Out of Danish, that's what they're placed with.
Right. Yeah, it's used for cooking. It's not terribly sweet. Has anybody ever tasted like Caro syrup or corn syrup? It's not terribly sweet. Like it tastes a little sweet, but it's not like you wouldn't make Kool-Aid with it or something. It wouldn't be nearly sweet enough. So it gives it that texture, but it's not really that sweet. So what happens in high fructose corn syrup is you take that corn syrup and you do a little bit of chemistry to it to break down some of the more complex carbohydrates in the corn syrup and turn them into fructose, which makes it much sweeter. So what's the point of high fructose corn syrup? Why do we have it? Why do we use it? Yeah.
It's cheap.
It's cheap. Why is it cheap? Yeah, sucrose comes mostly from out of the country. It comes from sugarcane, from the Caribbean and Central and South America. So it has to be imported, and it's subject to tariffs, import taxes. Corn is grown here and is subsidized through farm bills and things like that. So it's actually cheaper even than it would be on an open market. So anything you can make from corn is going to be much cheaper. The other advantage of high fructose corn syrup from a production standpoint is that it's a liquid, whereas sucrose is a solid. And syrups are much easier for machines to deal with because you can have them squirt, a certain amount into something. You can have squirting machines, I guess, are easier than like scooping machines for, I don't know. So it's easier. And you can also dissolve it more easily at lower temperatures. If you ever tried to put a bunch of sugar in iced tea or something, it doesn't really dissolve. It kind of just settles down to the bottom. A sugar syrup doesn't do that. It incorporates much more nicely. So that's the reasons that we use it. But it's actually not really different from sucrose. And anybody who tells you that they don't like the taste of it is also fooling you and also probably themselves, because in properly controlled tests, nobody can ever tell the difference between the two. In fact, it was formulated originally specifically to be indistinguishable from sugar in flavor. So it's true that it isn't good for you. Absolutely not good for you. But it's also not worse for you than sugar. That's sugar, and it's not good for you, and you shouldn't eat a bunch of it, except for right now, because you got to finish all this candy. But other times, you shouldn't eat too much sugar, bad for your teeth, and all that stuff. So diabetes, whatnot. Yeah. So anyway, don't be especially afraid of high fructose corn syrup. In fact, if you really want something that's high fructose, there is a sweetener called agave nectar. I don't know if you've seen that. That's actually 80% fructose. That's like super extra high fructose. But nobody thinks about that one, that's completely inconsistent logic. If more fructose means bad, then that should be like the worst thing. And actually there is evidence that fructose is not great for you, which is where this comes from. It's not just like somebody made it up that this would be bad for you. Fructose specifically does lead to more what they call visceral fat, which is the saturated fat that collects around organs and tends to lead to the bad effects of that sort of thing. And that has been linked to fructose specifically. But an extra 5% of fructose in your sweetener is really not, showing that. And if you look at studies that compare sucrose to high fructose corn syrup, they don't see that difference. It's only when fructose, like pure fructose, is compared to pure glucose that you start to see that. All right. Yeah, fructose is in fruit as well, which is another, I should have brought the paper. There's an interesting study, because I've had this question a lot when we talk about this, like, well, doesn't fruit have a bunch of fructose and a bunch of sugar in it, so shouldn't we not eat fruit? And the answer is, fruit has a lot of other stuff in it, particularly water and fiber. So if you eat whole fruit, it's actually almost unpleasant to eat enough fruit that it would be a significant increase in sugar in your diet. And there's a study that showed this. They tried to, I don't remember exactly what the number is. Maybe some of you know from your healthcare stuff, but there's a specific percent of calories that you're not supposed to get from sugar. Like, you're supposed to have less than 10% of your daily calories come from sugars or something like that. 20%. I don't remember the number. Yeah. But anyway, there's some number that's not supposed to be from sugar. So they said, well, what if people got that much, but just from fruit and not from soda and whatever? Would it still have those bad effects? And they had to cancel the study because people couldn't do it, because you had to eat like 10 apples and 5 bananas a day or something to actually get that much sugar.
Okay, it's like there's actually 60 grams of sugar a day.
Okay.
And that's with everything. But there's actually people who follow this crazy diet. It's just like every other diet of these crazy people who think it's a good idea. They eat bananas all day.
Yeah.
They eat
just all bananas all day.
Bananas.
I didn't know that's just one of the diets. It's called being fruitarian. They eat like a ton of fruit all day long and some.
Right.
And because they eliminated everything else out of their diet, they see weight loss and increased energy and skin problems. But
and what's that disease when you don't get enough protein? That also.
Amino acids and all that stuff that you're not going to get.
Yeah.
It's just another one that's.
That's why I was wondering what the composition of like how much actual fructose is in a piece of fruit.
Yeah, I mean, we can look that up for different kinds of fruit. I'm not sure, but the issue is getting to that fruit makes it a lot different than getting it in getting to that fructose through fruit means you're breaking down stuff. It means you're taking in a bunch of water with it, because fruits are mostly water. It means you've got fiber in there that your body's dealing with also. It's a lot different from drinking a drink that's just got all that stuff that goes straight to your body, straight to your blood or whatever. Yeah. So one of the things that is kind of sad about this is that the evil candy makers that we love and soda makers, not really evil, but they've taken advantage of this people being afraid of high fructose corn syrup to simply reformulate things with sugar instead, and then still sell them to everybody as all natural whatevers, when really it's the same. It's still something you should be drinking a whole lot of. Same thing with fruit juices, by the way. If you've seen juices that are advertised as 100% juice, and they're supposed to be better because they're 100% juice, they're generally made from concentrates like white grape and pear concentrates, which are just like added sugar. They're not like actually just squeezed juices. So really all that stuff, drinking anything but water, really, we should think of as kind of a treat, as something that we do, well, other than like tea and coffee. But sweetened beverages should be thought of as, you know, a sometimes treat, like a cookie or whatever, that is yummy and that we enjoy, but that we don't get a lot of our nutrition from. Okay, so let's talk about sweetness. Oh, we've got that. I have some numbers here. There we go. All right, so there's a table. I'll just put it up here instead of writing down a bunch of numbers. You can see this on page 602. But here's some relative sweetness of different sweeteners. And check out first the regular carbohydrates on the left. So you've got sucrose, which is set to 1. That's just standard sugar. And then you can see how these other sweeteners kind of stack up next to that. So a sugar like fructose is a bit sweeter than sugar. Pure fructose is sweeter than sucrose. Glucose is less sweet, as you might expect, because sucrose is kind of in the middle of the two. So we tend not to sweeten things with just glucose. And then you have some of the other sugars like lactose, milk sugar, very much lower. And then over on the right, you have artificial sweeteners. Saccharin, asulfame K, aspartame, and sucralose. And notice their sweetness is relative to sucrose. Pretty big, right?
What is saccharin used in?
Saccharin is not used much anymore. It was a really popular sweetener for a long time. It comes in the little pink packets, Sweet and Low. Have you ever seen that?
Yeah, that's the one with all the lawsuits and stuff. Or that, like, they had rat poison in it or something?
Yeah, for a long time, anything made with saccharin had to have a warning label on it that said, this product contains saccharin, which is known to cause cancer in laboratory animals. That has since been retracted. And for the last 10 years or so, there is no warning on saccharin because it turns out that that study was in error. They were using mice that get cancer from everything because it's that breed of mice that just gets a lot of cancer all the time. So they actually couldn't draw a conclusion from that sweetener itself. So anyway, that did make it kind of fall out of favor. People nowadays tend not to like it because it has kind of a bitter aftertaste to it. But if you grew up with it, some people really seek it out, which is why you still see the Sweet and Low packets as a choice for people who are used to that. There's also a soda, one of the first diet sodas called Tab. Comes in kind of a pinkish can that is sweetened with saccharin. And I usually, when I've done this class in the past or in other classes, I've brought in some Tab, and people pretty much don't like it, like across the board. But people who grew up in that era where Tab was popular and got used to it do really like it. So I always give it to some colleagues that I know that are really into Tab. It's kind of. Okay, let's talk about these artificial sweeteners and these. Which I can't find the structures of, and the sweetness. So you notice that the artificial sweeteners that I just closed the book on were way, way sweeter than sugar, and the hundreds of times sweeter than sugar. And that's important. That's one of the key features of the artificial sweeteners is that you need such a tiny amount to give the same amount of sugar. So I just realized that this actually has structures. I forgot a different book. So does anybody drink things with artificial sweeteners? Yeah. No more?
Yeah.
Done?
Because I think they showed recently that they raised your insulin, there's still insulin response.
Right.
So,
And it increases your cravings.
forget about it. Which one?
I'm sure it's
Guess what?
So I was like, I'm sure the sugar does the same. Because that sort of makes your cravings go up. So you end up eating more. It's like a psychological thing too.
All right, so here's some of those structures of those different artificial sweeteners.
You took that to be like a candy break.
Yes. The whole class should be a candy break, really. Don't even pay attention to your candy.
It is in the previous.
Is
If
it?
anyone who gets the previous
All right.
sucrose, yeah, just sucralose, though, not all of that. Just sucralose. Oh, yeah? But that's black. Yeah.
So you'll notice that most of these look nothing like sugars, with one exception.
Sucralose, though.
Yeah. Sucralose, which is Splenda, actually is the same structure as sucrose, but 3 of the OHs have been replaced by CLs. Yeah? So you do that and you make something that's like 600 times sweeter than sugar. It's also then not really digested. So the reason that these are, work, they're known as non-nutritive sweeteners, right? They don't give you any nutrition, they don't give you calories. First, they're way sweeter than sugar. So the actual amount of a sweetener like sucralose that you would consume in a drink for the same sweetness level as sugar is minuscule. Right? 600 times less for the same sweetness amount. If you ever, has anybody ever baked with Splenda? Like you get this giant bag that says measures cup for cup like sugar, but it weighs like a pillow. It's like nothing. And even that is not mostly that molecule. It's all filler. It's deposited on this stuff called maltodextrin, which is just kind of this fluffy, non-nutritive fiber kind of stuff. So really that whole bag, you could, and people have done this on the internet, you can extract it yourself. You can do a little chemistry with some like grain alcohol or hexane, and you can actually just dissolve the sucralose and then evaporate it out and just have the pure sucralose. And the amount of sucralose that you get from an entire bag like that is like almost nothing. It's some tiny amount. So that's part of it, that you just need way less of these things. And then the other thing is that we can kind of trace these through the body and see that they mostly don't break down like sugars. They mostly just kind of go through and don't produce the kind of nutritive byproducts, the byproducts that lead to things that your body can process as energy, and that's why they don't give you any calories. Recently, there's some research that's come out that's shown that could potentially be a problem, because when these things make it to your gut, they seem to actually be interfering with the gut bacteria, the gut flora, the bacteria in your intestines that are, and then it also ultimately end up affecting your insulin response and things like that. Although that study was blown a little bit out of proportion because it really only looked at saccharin, which is not used that much anymore. But that could be something to look at in the future, that these things, even though we know they don't actually get into your system, they could be causing some problems at the back end of your system just by the things that they encounter. So aspartame, which is a common artificial or non-nutritive sweetener, is also known as NutraSweet or Equal. You can't see the picture I'm pointing to, but there's a little Equal packet over there. That is the most common by far artificial sweetener. That's the Diet Coke and Diet Pepsi and Diet pretty much everything. And if you look at gum often is made of some different sweeteners. We're kind of working together. So you've got here aspartame, mannitol, and acesulfame K, which are all some different kinds of sweeteners. And sometimes even stuff with sugar in it has aspartame also to make it a little bit sweeter if they're trying to hit a particular calorie mark. Like a lot of things that come in, a 100-calorie pack or a yogurt that says 100 calories will have sugar in it, but then it'll also have some aspartame so that they don't have to put quite as much sugar in it. And these sugar-free ones, I think, don't have that, right? Yeah, so these are sucralose mainly, but yeah. So the isomalt and the maltitol are the excessive consumption may have a laxative effect, right?
That's the maltitol.
Right. So, excuse me. What?
Is it true?
It was a Tootsie Roll. It was a bad choice in the middle of talking.
So is that like what people should eat after they have surgeries or something?
No.
No, it'll make you feel
Yeah.
really.
If you need laxative, just take some laxative. Something a little more gentle. This stuff,
I mean, it's pretty
and you need to eat a lot. Like you need to eat a lot of, like a bag of that to actually have some issues. The problem, right. Yeah, you'll know. You'll feel it coming.
But it makes you wonder about the bacteria, though.
Right. If that's the issue. So the in baking, it's not such a big issue. You can use sucralose or aspartame or whatever when you're baking a cake because that sugar is really just there to provide sweetness. In a candy, it's different because candy is just made of sugar. So if you can't have sugar in it, you need something else that gives that structure. Sugar is part of the structure, part of the whole thing of the stuff. So they need these other things. So this isomalt and maltitol are sugars. Maltitol comes from maltose that have been reduced to the alcohol. So instead of an aldehyde or a ketone, it would have an alcohol there, and that makes it indigestible, but it doesn't really make it sweeter. So with the other types of non-nutritive sweeteners, you're using a tiny amount because they're so much sweeter. With the sugar alcohols, they're not really sweeter, they're just non-nutritive. So if you eat a bunch of it, it's just gonna go through and push everything else out with it. And that's where that effect comes from. So any of these kind of sugar-free candies or chocolates will generally have that kind of a warning. Right? And it also tells us a little bit about kind of the point of artificial sweeteners. Now, artificial sweeteners are a huge business, but really they're designed for a specific segment of the population, people like type 1 diabetics, who really would not be able to experience things that are sweet without these types of ingredients. And so these provide a really important option or a really important service to people who really can't have sugar and really can't have any of these other types of nutritive sweeteners because of health issues. They've become really big business because people think that this is a way to kind of get free sweetness without calories. And now we know that it's a little bit more complicated than that. Now, most of the health concerns of these things that you find like on the internet or in weird emails from your relatives are way overblown. People think aspartame causes everything from like every cancer to like lupus to whatever, and it's never been, none of that has any science behind it at all. Does that mean that we should just drink a bunch of it? No. And some of these newer studies about the gut bacteria show that there could be some issues with it. There have been some studies showing that it doesn't actually stop you from eating more calories because it gives you that sweetness without the calories. It makes you just eat more calories elsewhere, like without thinking about it.
Like the people with the big ass fatty cooks and big extra
Right. Right. Although there's also been some other research that shows that some amount of artificially sweetened beverage can help people with a long-term weight loss program because it gives them some of that sweetness back. So, there's a lot of evidence here, and it's probably not, and it's not considered anything really dangerous. Those biggest fears, like if you Google aspartame, you get a couple legitimate links, and then it's like, yeah, right, all that kind of nonsense. So don't believe any of that, but it doesn't mean that this stuff should just be eaten as much as possible, especially not the ones that make you shit your pants. So. Okay, so the last part that we want to talk about is, I'm going to leave that up here, is the complex carbohydrates and the larger sugars. So these I'm definitely not going to attempt to draw. Maybe we could, I guess. But these are really important in really every aspect of our life as well. You can't see that. Okay, let's try that. Cellulose. Anybody know about cellulose? What's that? Wood. Yeah, plants. All the structure of plants and wood and all of that is cellulose. So cellulose is what you get when that most stable form of glucose links with itself in a polymer, meaning it's just over and over again for hundreds and thousands of units, you have this polymer that is known as cellulose. That's cell walls, and that gives rigidity. So it's extremely stable. Right? That kind of a molecule, that's what supports a whole tree, a bunch of those. Very stable and hard to break down. We can't digest wood, right? Actually, can we? I don't actually know that. I assume we can because they don't eat wood, but yeah. Some parts of it maybe. I think that's part of the fiber thing, right? That it just kind of goes through. It's not soluble. So anyway, that's cellulose, and that comes from, this is what we call a polysaccharide, a complex carbohydrate, many sugars. You change the stereochemistry, the geometry a little bit, and you completely change the structures. So this is also a polymer of glucose over and over again. But you'll notice that there's the oxygen here is linked in a slightly different way. Rather than straight, it kind of goes down and then over. And so now, instead of cellulose, we have starch, which is easily digestible, right? Things like potatoes, corn, rice, all that stuff. We've got amylose, insoluble in cold water, and then amylopectin, which is soluble in cold water, and is actually the same thing, just a different length chains. And so just by changing that bit of stereochemistry, now we have the starches that we eat, all the time, things that come from stuff like rice and potatoes and all that. And so our body would break these down into glucose, so it would break these links down the same way that we would get by eating glucose. So that's why these kind of highly refined flour, rice, potatoes, things like that are not appreciably different from your body standpoint from eating sugar. It's a little bit better, but not a whole lot better. Better for your teeth, certainly, but not necessarily better for your rest of you, I guess. Okay. So where else do we see sugars? Anybody know? What else is important about sugars in your body? Well, that's, kind of what we looked at. But sugars also make up the basis of DNA. If you've ever seen this kind of a structure, I'm definitely not going to draw that. So that's the structure of DNA. And DNA has what's called, these bases that are linked through sugar type units. So this is known as a sugar phosphate backbone. Excuse me. And then these things will hydrogen bond with each other to hold that helix together. But that's also coming from a sugar type structure. So you see that ring structure with then the CH2 to the O, and then those sugars are linked by phosphorus in DNA. So carbohydrates are broken down in that way as well. And then there's an interesting story on page 603 in your book about how these sugars also contribute to blood type and whether or not different types of antigens will be able to exist together, depending on how those things are. I think that's just because they missed the, it's like a significant part of our diet. You can't just not eat it forever and expect to not miss it. I don't know. Yeah, maybe that's it. All right, so that's all I got to say. Questions about sugars? Sorry. I could keep talking, but it was stop making sense. So you're welcome to stick around if you want to start working on some of those problems or ask questions or go home, take some candy with you. We'll be back on Wednesday. Get going on the exam. I mean, no, not really. I don't know what I would ask exactly.
Who's making the final table
Me,
Just you?
just me.
Oh, okay.
And you. Oh yeah, and you.
Yeah. Or not.
Oh yeah, you missed that part.
Yeah.
You wanna fill her in?
Oh,
Go ahead.
questions that we want on the exam, we focus on lab work, practice them, and mental choose on choose your question.
So, how many of our questions are you gonna choose?
Depends on how well they fit and if they're good questions with that makes sense and everything.
Wait, so are you gonna post all the tests, them to put one blank on the?
Yes.
Thank you.
I will do that.